At 38, Usain Bolt. Finally named the 5 runners who gave him hell. There is a version of Usain Bolt the world never fully saw. Not the man celebrating before the finish line, not the lightning bolt pose, not the smile that made dominance look like it cost nothing. There is a version that existed in the quiet before races, in the hotel rooms the night before finals, in the training sessions where the body was pushed past the point where confidence alone could carry it. At 38, far enough from competition to finally say it plainly, Bolt named the 5 runners who made that version of him necessary. Greatness does not exist without resistance. Every record Bolt set, every gold medal he collected, every finish line he crossed with a margin that made the result look inevitable, all of it was shaped by the men who forced him to become more than he would have been without them. He never said their names the way rivals say names in the heat of competition. He was always too composed for that, too aware of the image he was carrying. But at 38, sitting with the distance that retirement provides, he finally said what he had always known. 5 runners, 5 different versions of the same problem, 5 men who gave him hell in ways the highlights never fully captured. Number 5, Tyson Gay. The pressure did not always come from where the world expected it. Before Justin Gatlin became the name that defined the rivalry era, before the controversies settled into their permanent positions in the historical narrative, there was a period when the most credible threat to Usain Bolt came from a quiet, technically precise sprinter from Lexington, Kentucky, who approached the 100 meters with a discipline that made him dangerous in a way that raw speed alone could never manufacture. Tyson Gay was not a showman. He did not occupy space the way Bolt occupied space. He did not carry an aura into a stadium that made the result feel predetermined before the gun fired. What he carried instead was execution. A start that was mechanically close to perfect. A drive phase that covered ground with an efficiency that coaches pointed to as a model, and a top-end speed that in any other era would have made him the undisputed standard the sport measured everything against. The 2009 Berlin World Championships was the moment that defined their dynamic most completely. Gay had arrived, believing, with genuine evidence to support the belief, that the gap between him and Bolt was not as permanent as the previous results suggested. He had been running times that placed him in a different category from the rest of the field. He had prepared with a specificity of purpose that suggested a man who had identified exactly what needed to happen for the result to go differently. What happened instead was Bolt running 9.58 seconds, a world record so far beyond what the moment required that it did not feel like a response to Gay's challenge. It felt like a statement that the challenge itself had been misunderstood. Gay ran one of the fastest races in history that day and finished behind a performance that made his best feel like a different conversation entirely. Bolt said that what Gay gave him was the one thing that pure dominance can never provide for itself: genuine uncertainty in the preparation phase. The knowledge that, on a given day, if everything went wrong at once, Gay had the tools to make the margin uncomfortable. That uncertainty never became reality on the track, but it lived in the training, in the decisions about preparation, in the way Bolt approached the months leading into Berlin with a seriousness that the results suggested had not been necessary, but that Gay's existence had made feel essential. The hell Gay gave him was never loud. It was the quiet hell of knowing that somewhere in another training facility, a man was working with a precision that deserved a different outcome than the one he kept receiving. That is its own kind of pressure, and Bolt carried it every time Gay's name appeared on a start list. Number 4, Asafa Powell, the threat that came from inside the foundation. Asafa Powell was not simply a rival. He was the standard that existed before Bolt arrived and made the standard irrelevant. The man who held the world record. The sprinter who had proven that a small Caribbean nation could not just compete at the highest level of the 100 meters, but could own it. For a young Bolt still finding his way through the professional circuit, Powell was not an opponent to be studied for weaknesses. He was the proof that the destination Bolt was moving toward was real, that made what followed between them more complicated than a straightforward competitive rivalry could ever be. They trained in the same national system, carried the same flag, felt the same weight of Jamaican expectation in a way that no athlete from any other country could fully understand. The pressure to represent was not external for either of them. It was built into the identity. And when Bolt's rise began to move Powell from the center of the narrative toward its edges, the shift happened in an environment where they could not simply be strangers. They were too connected for that, too embedded in the same world for the transition to be clean. Bolt said that Powell gave him hell in a way that no external rival could replicate. Because losing to Powell, or being genuinely pushed by Powell, carried a meaning that losing to an American or a European never could. It was internal. It touched the part of the competitive identity that is about belonging rather than about winning. The part that asks not just whether you are the fastest in the world, but whether you are the fastest at home. Whether the system that produced you still believes you are its best product. Powell pushed that question harder than anyone. Not through confrontation, not through public statements or competitive trash talk, through the simple act of continuing to be elite in the same environment where Bolt was trying to establish that elite was no longer the right word for what he was. The hell Powell gave him was the hell of proximity, of sharing everything except the finish line. And for a period of time, that sharing made every training session carry a weight the competition alone never produces. Number 3, Yohan Blake. The hell that came from the lane next to him. There is a category of competitive threat that exists separately from everything produced by external rivals. It does not arrive from another country or another system or another approach to the same event. It arrives from within, from the training environment, from the daily sessions where preparation is built, and where the people who know you most completely are also the people most capable of identifying exactly where the edges of your ability actually sit. Yohan Blake found those edges. And what he did with that knowledge gave Bolt a version of hell that the global stage never fully replicated. Blake was not introduced to the world with ceremony. He did not carry the natural charisma that makes athletes visible before their performances justify the attention. He was quiet in the way that certain competitors are quiet, not because they lack confidence, but because they have identified something more useful than noise to direct their energy toward. They called him the Beast for a reason that had nothing to do with personality and everything to do with what he produced when the starting gun fired. His starts were sharper than anything Bolt had faced from a training partner. His aggression through the first 30 meters operated at a level that forced Bolt to recalibrate what he understood about the internal competition within his own camp. Where Bolt relied on the rhythm of his stride, on the natural length that his body produced when allowed to fully express itself, Blake relied on intensity, on the refusal to give the race any space to settle into a pattern that favored the man beside him. The Jamaican trials before the London 2012 Olympics produced the moment that defined everything between them. This was not a global stage. There were no 80,000 people and no world record pressure and no narrative being constructed in real time for an international audience. This was internal, the place where reputations are tested without the protection of the occasion to frame the result. Blake beat him. Clearly, without the kind of ambiguity that allows a result to be explained away in the debrief afterward. Bolt was not the fastest man in his own training environment, and while the world outside continued to treat the London final as a formality, something had already shifted beneath the surface of everything the public was being shown. Bolt said that no single result in his career produced the specific kind of hell that the trials loss to Blake produced. Not because losing to a training partner was more painful than losing on the Olympic stage, but because of what it revealed, that the gap he had assumed existed between himself and everyone around him, including the people who trained beside him every day, was not as permanent as he had allowed himself to believe. That Blake had been closing it in silence, while Bolt had been managing his preparation with the assumption of a distance that was no longer there. London answered the question in the way Olympic finals answer questions. Bolt won. He reasserted the order that the trials had temporarily disrupted and gave the global audience the result they had already decided was inevitable. But the hell Blake had given him in that internal moment did not disappear because the public result went the right way. It stayed. It changed how Bolt approached every training session that followed, made him less willing to assume, more willing to be genuinely pushed by the person in the next lane, rather than managing the session from a position of comfortable superiority. That is the hell a great training partner gives you, not the hell of public defeat, the hell of having your assumptions corrected in private, where only you and the people closest to you understand what it actually cost. Number 2, DeGrasse. The hell that arrived without warning and refused to apologize for itself. By the time the Rio 2016 Olympic Games arrived, Usain Bolt had already defined the era so completely that the question being asked at every major championship was no longer whether he would win. It was whether the margin would be large enough to feel like the dominance the sport had come to expect from him. He had won in Beijing, he had won in London, the triple-triple, 3 consecutive Olympic Games, 3 gold medals each time, was within reach, and the world had already begun treating it as a formality rather than an achievement. Andre DeGrasse had not received that memo. He was young in the way that certain athletes are young, not just in years, but in the specific quality of a competitor who has not yet learned to be intimidated by the size of the occasion or the reputation of the person beside them. He had grown up watching Bolt the way his entire generation had grown up watching Bolt. With admiration, with genuine appreciation for what was being produced, but without the fear that the previous generation had carried into lanes beside him. To DeGrasse, Bolt was not an untouchable figure whose presence on the start list changed what was possible. He was simply the man in the next lane. The semi-final of the 200 meters in Rio was the moment that produced the hell Bolt had not anticipated. Not because DeGrasse won, he did not, but because of what he did in the second half of a race that should have been comfortable for Bolt in a semi-final that existed only to qualify for the final and conserve the energy the final would require. DeGrasse stayed with him, not just close enough to look across, close enough that what had begun as a qualification run had transformed, without announcement or agreement, into something that felt like a genuine contest. And as they approached the line, DeGrasse did something that very few athletes had ever done in that situation. He smiled. Not the smile of a man who had exceeded his own expectations. The smile of a man who had confirmed something he already believed, that he belonged there. That the gap the era had constructed between Bolt and every other sprinter on the planet was a gap that his generation was not going to continue treating as permanent. Bolt responded in the only language that mattered. He pushed through the line harder than the semi-final required, refused to allow the moment to be defined by DeGrasse's terms, and won in a way that reasserted the order without making it look effortless. Then he glanced across. The glance was not the playful interaction the cameras usually captured between them. It was something sharper, something that communicated clearly that what DeGrasse had done had been noticed and would not be forgotten before the final. Bolt said that what DeGrasse gave him in Rio was the hell of the future arriving before he was ready to acknowledge it. Not the threat of losing. The threat of being replaced not through defeat, but through the simple, relentless confidence of a generation that had decided the era belonged to them and had not asked permission to begin claiming it. That is a different category of hell. It does not arrive through a result on a scoreboard. It arrives through a smile in a semi-final that tells you the world is already moving in a direction you cannot control. Number 1. Justin Gatlin. The hell that never ended. The name that stayed with him longest. The rivalry that was never really about running. Justin Gatlin's story was complicated before it ever intersected with Bolt's in a way that mattered. An Olympic champion, a proven elite sprinter, a man whose career had been defined by extraordinary talent and equally extraordinary controversy. 2 doping bans. A return to competition that the sport had not anticipated and had not fully prepared itself to manage. And times, post-return, that made the comfort of dismissing him as a historical figure impossible to sustain. When Gatlin came back, he came back fast. Not competitive in the way that keeps a former champion present in conversations without genuinely threatening the results. Fast in the way that forced every other name in the sport to acknowledge that the margin between themselves and the top of the 100 meters had someone new standing inside it who had not been expected to return and had returned anyway. For Bolt, Gatlin represented something that none of the other 4 names on this list had represented. Not just a competitive threat, a narrative problem. Because the story the sport needed to tell about the era Bolt dominated was a story about clean greatness, about a finish line that meant what it looked like it meant, about a champion whose records came without the asterisk that had followed so many names through the previous decades. Every time Gatlin lined up beside him, that story became more complicated to tell. Bolt said that the hell Gatlin gave him was never simple. It was layered in a way that the physical challenge of racing him could not fully account for. There was the competitive reality. Gatlin was genuinely fast, genuinely prepared, genuinely capable of producing a result on any given day that would have rewritten the narrative the sport was trying to protect. That was real, and it was something Bolt prepared for with the seriousness it deserved. But beneath the competitive reality was something that went beyond preparation. The knowledge that a result going the wrong way in a final against Gatlin carried a meaning that a result going the wrong way against any other rival could not produce. That a loss to Gatlin was not just a loss. It was a statement that the era had not been what the sport had decided to say it was. That the clarity Bolt represented had been defeated not by a rising star or a teammate or a generational talent making its first claim on the top step, but by the one name that carried the specific history the sport was most desperate to leave behind. London 2017 produced the result that everything had been building towards without anyone on either side of it fully admitting the collision was coming. Bolt was no longer at the physical peak that had made the previous decade feel like a demonstration rather than a competition. The margins were smaller, the finishes were tighter, and Gatlin, against every expectation the crowd inside that stadium had brought with them, was still there, still fast, still willing to step into a final that most of the world had already decided belonged to Bolt, even at the end of his career. Gatlin crossed the line first. The reaction from the crowd was not celebration, it was resistance, booing that filled the stadium in a way that communicated exactly what the result meant to the people watching it. Not just that their man had lost, but that the story had ended in a way that felt wrong, that the final chapter had been written by the one name they had spent years refusing to accept as part of the narrative. And then Gatlin walked over to Bolt and bowed. Bolt said that the bow was the moment he understood most completely what the rivalry had always actually been about. Not speed, not competition, not the technical reality of two elite sprinters producing their best efforts in the same final at the same moment. It was about what the sport needed to believe about itself and what the result had just made permanently more difficult to sustain. The hell Gatlin gave him was the hell that outlasted the competition, the hell that did not end when the race ended or when the career ended or when the distance of retirement began to make everything feel smaller than it had felt in the moment. It was the hell of a result that could not be reframed, that sat in the record books exactly as it happened, that forced a conversation the sport had been avoiding for years and could no longer avoid once the finish line had been crossed. Bolt never declared hatred toward Gatlin. That was never his way, and it was never what the rivalry required from him. But the name stayed, longer than the others, heavier than the others. Because what Gatlin represented was not just the toughest opponent he ever faced on a track. It was the clearest reminder that dominance, no matter how complete, no matter how sustained, no matter how many records and medals and moments it produces, is always temporary. And the man who delivered that reminder most completely was the one who gave him the most hell of all. At 38, Usain Bolt had nothing left to prove. The records stood, the medals were counted. The career had been completed in a way that left no meaningful argument unresolved about where he stood in the history of the event. What he had left was honesty. The particular honesty that arrives when the competition is gone and what remains is just the truth of what it had actually cost. 5 runners, 5 different categories of hell. Tyson Gay gave him the hell of precision. Asafa Powell gave him the hell of proximity. Yohan Blake gave him the hell of assumption corrected. DeGrasse gave him the hell of the future arriving uninvited. And Justin Gatlin gave him the hell that never fully resolved. The world saw the lightning bolt pose, the smile, the celebrations that made greatness look effortless. What the world did not always see was the 5 names that made the effortless necessary, the men who gave him hell in ways that shaped every record he set and every finish line he crossed. At 38, he finally said their names, and the hell they had given him sounded, in the telling of it, like the most important part of the story he had ever run.